President Biden is receiving bipartisan applause for his response to the Israel-Hamas conflict. But his show of solidarity with Israel risks alienating a bloc of the electorate that's been overlooked, Arabs and Muslims. As veteran Democratic strategist Waleed Shahid pointed out, quote, "There will be a non-insignificant number of Arabs, Muslims, and young voters who sit out 2024 or vote for Cornel West instead of Joe Biden in states like Michigan and Georgia, given his near one-sided support of Netanyahu's far-right government's atrocities," unquote.
MSNBC anchor Mehdi Hassan parroted Waleed's sentiment on X, writing, quote, "Dems need to wake up to this. I'm hearing and seeing this everywhere. This conflict and Biden's position on it could literally help decide a super close country-defining presidential election 13 months from now." A new CBS poll and YouGov poll shows Americans have mixed feelings on Biden's handling of the conflict in the Middle East. 44% approve of how he's responded, while 54% disapprove. When broken down by party, 66% of Democrats approve, while 28% of Republicans do. 61% of independents disapprove of his response to the Israel-Hamas war. So I think something that they didn't mention here, they're focusing a lot on identity politics, a lot on race, and a lot on religion. But I think if we look at the recent polling by Quinnipiac, we see that 18 to 34-year-olds are 39% supportive of this. So that's a huge majority. It's about 61% that is not supportive of Biden's decision-making here and does not support, moreover, more aid going to Israel, which looks like is Biden's plan. And that was a huge block of voters that helped deliver the presidency for Joe Biden in 2020. So I think going into 2024, he's got to consider young voters. Is he going to actually represent them now and earn their vote again? And he's also got to consider this really important faction of voters, Arabs and Muslims.
Yeah, I think it's notable that sort of the split there on voters who support Biden's plan and people who don't support it kind of mirrors the overall Biden approval slide that we've seen since he took office, right? I mean, he's underwater on basically every approval metric that you look at. He's especially bad on handling the economy and on national security. The American people are just not impressed with what Joe Biden's doing. And part of that is because he made such, from his basement in 2020, such lofty promises about this is going to be a return to normalcy. We're going to be respected again on the world stage. The adults are going to be in the room. We're going to build back better. We're going to implement Bidenomics. All these things just never happened. You know, inflation has continued to rage, even though the White House tried to deny it at the beginning. National security is clearly in doubt. You have the State Department now warning American travelers anywhere in the globe that they're in danger of potential attacks. You have just everything sort of going in the wrong direction for Joe Biden, and the American people are seeing that. So I think it's unsurprising that when you ask people about this situation, they're not any more confident in what he is planning to do or what he ultimately will end up doing. I do think, obviously, when it comes to young voters, this is an issue that is more sort of front of mind for them. We've seen that on a lot of college campuses where student groups have signed on to these documents and statements basically blaming Israel for the rape and massacre of its own people. And so I think this is an issue where they're going to be a lot more vocal. Granted, Joe Biden has the help of a lot of the mainstream media and also has the help of, using apps like TikTok, where Democrats have a much larger use base and advantage than Republicans do. But I don't think that this is going to be the thing that makes or breaks him, because when you take the whole picture of what the Biden administration has done and what Biden policies have been, or whatever the Biden doctrine when it comes to foreign policy is, none of it has worked. We've just seen people around the world, enemies of freedom around the world, specifically emboldened by the Biden administration, whether that's looking at what happened in Afghanistan after the U.S. withdrawal. You have the Taliban taking over and causing, just a horrible situation there, human rights violations, things like that. You have, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that President Biden tried to stop by working with the Chinese to talk Putin out of it. That blew up in his face as well. And now we have the situation in Israel where you have Iranian-backed terrorists continuing to launch rockets at Israeli civilians. And so the Biden foreign policy, whether it's this specific issue or anything else, is not a winning one, and his whole administration seems to just be one where the American people don't agree with him.
Yeah, and I honestly don't think it's going to hurt Donald Trump's presidency. He recently spoke out saying he's critical of Biden giving $100 million in aid to Palestinians. He did not criticized Joe Biden for giving $105 billion to Israel. So Donald Trump could have said, you know, if I was president, this conflict never would have happened in the first place. And a lot of his base might have believed him. They might have been like, yeah, Trump would have negotiated with the president of Israel and the prime minister Netanyahu, Herzog and Netanyahu. President Trump would have figured out a solution. They might believe that. He could have ran on that, but instead, he's pretty much saying that if he were president, he would pretty much do what Joe Biden is doing minus the $100 million in aid to Palestinians. It seems that the president is saying he supports Israel, and he would if he was president. He would support our allies. We could have had a scenario where Biden being president during this conflict and still supporting Israel and escalating the conflict by having the ambassador to the United Nations vote against a ceasefire, that could have meant that if you were an anti-war voter, that you could have voted for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump pretty much made clear that that's not really what you'd be voting for, which I think does open up a lane for an independent in a way that wouldn't just be pulling votes from Joe Biden. And so this conflict is really shaping the 2024 presidential election in unprecedented ways here.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I do think it's interesting looking at sort of how Trump governed last time around and what he's campaigning on this time around. Obviously, the Trump administration's policy for the 4 years he was in office was basically, if you kill or threaten Americans, the Americans will kill you. And it seems that this time around it might be similar, although, again, what he's doing is not too dissimilar from what Joe Biden has called for. Meanwhile, a new piece in the Intelligencer zeroes in on the seeming irony or hypocrisy among the Republican Party, in which Congress, where they have vehemently opposed sending more aid to Ukraine, but are open to sending help to Israel, no holds barred.
This is a really fascinating piece here. So I don't know. I think there's a division within the Republicans. I don't really see it as hypocrisy. I just think Republicans are super divided. You have so many populist Republicans, you could say, populist right-wing Republicans, the Freedom Caucus, for example, that says very different things from the mainline party Republicans. You have a huge group that is super anti-war, that is super critical of the decision to spend more money on defense when we have so many problems at home. It's kind of a new iteration of this America First thing that Donald Trump ran on in 2016. A lot of people are saying, hey, that means we're not giving money to foreign wars. So I don't know if I see it as hypocrisy so much as division within the party.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, somebody on the right I've talked to, a lot of lawmakers amid the speaker fight, and this obviously being the news comes up quite a bit. And I do agree. I don't think it's hypocrisy. I think the people who are on both sides of this are the same people who would have said the same thing if it happened, you know, a year ago or 2 years ago or during Trump's administration. There are a lot of people in the Republican Party who are still trying to claw back war powers that the president sort of gobbled up during previous administrations, and they don't think that we should just keep doing this, especially the American First sort of agenda followers who are continuing to say, how can we do this when our border is open, when other things are happening? But I do think there's been this interesting sort of the split between what should happen for Ukraine and what should happen for Israel, and I think it's because these are two very different issues when you look at them. You know, it's a difference of who is doing the attacking. You know, you have a terrorist group that runs the government in the Gaza Strip doing this. You have the Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon who are launching things down, but they're all supported by the Iranians, whereas in Ukraine you have, you know, literally Russia is just marching across the border to kill Ukrainians. And so treating these things as if they're the same issue, I think, is a disservice, and I think goes back to the point about whenever they're passing budgets, you know, they should do these on a one-by-one basis, because there might be some people who agree with certain things and disagree with others, and just rolling it all into one doesn't really help anyone when it comes to explaining why they're voting the way that they do, or even just debating the issues. You have to separate it out so that way you can talk about the merits of each thing individually and not end up just stuck voting yes or no on a bill and then slammed for your vote regardless of how you voted.
Yeah, I think I'm just sick of members of both parties, Joe Biden included, trying to frame this as, you know, we're doing it because we're on the side of peace. We're doing this because we're on the side of justice now. When Biden, as a senator in 1986, gave a speech on the floor of Congress where he said, if there were not an Israel today, we would need to invent one. $3 billion is the best investment we'll ever make because having an Israel helps protect U.S. interests in the region. If they were more straightforward about why they wanted to fund Israel in this war, I think they would get more support if they were just honest and they said, listen, guys, there's a lot of anti-American sentiment in the region because we've been intervening in the Middle East for quite some time. This is our way to kind of quell that discontent and save America from potentially future terrorist attacks. Like, be really honest about what your strategic intent is in the region. If you talk to anyone who served in the State Department, they will say that that is precisely a factor here, if not the main factor. But framing these wars as necessary so that we're on the right side of history and we're fighting for justice, I think is just dishonest, especially when you can go back to Biden's old speeches where he tells you exactly why he thinks the U.S. needs to be involved in Israel. And so I think there's a lack of honesty here. And I think that is losing more votes than just the decision to fund Israel in this war against Hamas. A lot of folks drawing parallels with 9/11. I don't know if I'd do that, but I would draw parallels here with the United States funding the Mujahideen in their war against Russia. It was a larger geopolitical conflict. They saw this group as potentially strategic and to be in alignment with the United States interests. They decided to train them, they decided to arm them and fund them, and then they turned into the Taliban. And then they didn't like the United States because of how we destabilized the region. Similarly, we had Netanyahu supporting Hamas. And so I can see a lot of Republicans and a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment saying, you know what, Israel did something that we did straight from our playbook, and we actually have an interest as the United States of America to keep our people safe, to get involved. Just be honest. Don't make it seem like you're doing the right thing by supporting Israel. Just be honest about your strategic intent.
It is always interesting to go back and look at the speeches that then Senator Joe Biden gave when he was in the Senate, because he's flip-flopped on basically everything that he ever said from the Senate floor. But there does, I think you're right, seem to be this sort of loss of support just in general because of the way the government takes this sort of you can't handle the truth mentality whenever they're telling the American people what they're doing and why they're doing it. And we've seen when they do that kind of thing, you know, obviously it's harder to get buy-in from the American people and support for it. And I think that goes back to, as I mentioned in the previous segment, you know, why I expected a much stronger and more detailed speech from President Biden in the Oval Office last night, because this was an opportunity for him, when he knows his agenda is underwater with the American people, to really make a case, make a strong case for why the United States should be involved in Russia, or in Ukraine, excuse me, against Russia, or in Israel against Hamas terrorism, or anywhere else. And that we just didn't get that. And it seems to be, again, kind of the same thing where Democrats, especially like you were saying, rely on this is about democracy without ever really designating what that goal is or defining what their end game is and why we're doing the things that we're doing. It's always, we need money now because of democracy, but they never explain why that money from the taxpayers is actually helping democracy, if it even is at all. And I do think that does a disservice because, again, it's hard for the American people to wrap their mind around something that they're not even told. Whereas if they came to us and basically did a business pitch, sort of like Shark Tank, and explained we need this much money for this many years to do X, Y, and Z, I think you would have a lot more American people sign on to that because, again, it's a clear goal. It's not just another endless, the start of an endless, you know, use of money and human lives and everything else. And instead, they just don't do that. And it kind of goes back again to this idea that whether or not you can trust what the government tells you, or whether healthy skepticism is actually one of the key parts of being in a democracy and making sure that you know that what they're telling you might not always be the truth. And it's good to check it out and make sure you hold them accountable, even when they're purposefully nonspecific, to sort of prevent that accountability from ever coming their way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, on the front of democracy, we always use that as the guise. Well, we need to spread democracy abroad. There are these people all around the world that are, you know, terribly oppressed. Right now, as this is going on, it's completely distracting from the U.S. mission in Haiti. We decided to circumvent getting consensus in the United Nations, and instead we're calling it like a multi-nation approach and peace mission. Most Haitians don't want us there. We have framed the people fighting for liberation from a government they don't like as terrorists instead of freedom fighters. They're saying, hey, you put this guy in place as the head of state here. We didn't vote for him. We don't like him. The United States backed a coup of our democratically elected leader, and we've had 13 years of UN troops occupying the land here. They've been defecating in the water. It's confirmed that over 10,000 people got cholera. UN troops have had confirmed cases of raping the Haitians there. And then the United Nations, instead of saying, you know what, United States, we're not going to support this at all, although they didn't get a consensus, we now have Kenya as the face of this mission, even though it's entirely the United States not accepting the failure of their mission. And so it's U.S. U.S. intervention time and again without the calculation being made. Are we making the situation better or worse for the region or the American people? And I think that's missing. We didn't get that explanation from Biden. And unfortunately, we never do. But I think in the age of social media where information freely flows, U.S. is going to have to do intervention in a different, perhaps more honest way.
Yeah, I definitely agree that more honesty is generally the best policy. But I also wonder, you know, you were talking about Haiti, but when you look at other areas where the United States has gotten involved, you know, American soldiers have routinely been welcomed with applause and cheers and gratefulness around the world. But then you end up seeing situations where there's mission drift, where people, you know, sort of the bureaucracy takes over, the military contracts take over. And so what even may have been a good idea and what was, you know, spun honestly to the American people turns in, just because of the nature of the federal government and the way the United States and bureaucracy works, ends up going so far afield that it's just not what was promised. And I think, again, that's why it's so important for our leaders to be completely honest as much as they can. Obviously, in some of these situations, they're dealing with, you know, sensitive information. Some of that also, for the record, turns out to be false in certain cases. But as honest as they can be with what they know and what they want to do, because that's the only way you're going to build support among the American people. Because for too many of us, especially millennials, I mean, if you look at the events that have taken place in our lifespan. And there's a reason we don't trust the government. There's a reason we're disenchanted with the idea of government, you know, sort of taking care of us or helping us do what we want to do or build a good life. It's because we've seen them ruin so many lives, not just in the United States, but around the world. We've seen them waste so much human life and so much money. And there's no wonder that the American people aren't buying in just because Joe Biden says, hey, Jack, we're going to go here and do this. And the American people are saying, no, you don't even know what you're saying. How can we take your word for it that this is a good idea and a good use of taxpayer dollars, especially when things here at home domestically are going so poorly?
Yeah, I think the evidence in our everyday lives just doesn't shake up against the narratives they're trying to tell us. We know that they're lying to us. And young people in particular, are central right now in deciding how this conflict goes, quite honestly, not just because the median age of people in Gaza is 18, but so many young people are fighting with the IDF. So many people in Israel were protesting the Netanyahu regime because he was saying that we have to change the constitution, the judicial branch has too much power, and he was losing support within his own country. I think people within Israel who perhaps at one point welcomed U.S. support are now questioning that because they can see that the United States has strategic interests in the region. They can see the oil interest in wanting to control the oil industry, especially globally as a commodity, which is something the United States has always done. They can see them wanting to have geopolitical strategic power in the region, and that being why they're supporting Israel. And to escalate a conflict like this one, they're putting the Israeli people at risk. Imagine how fearful they are of retaliation because of what's gone on over the past week. And so I think, you know, so many people see that they're very young and they have a government that doesn't represent us. We often talk about the Palestinians and the Israelis instead of talking pretty precisely about the Netanyahu regime and their decisions, and that 4 in 5 Israelis actually blame Netanyahu for what's going down right now. And so I think a lot of people are just sick of governments leveraging huge militaries with huge weapons that have the ability to do insane damage, using things like white phosphorus and at worst using bombs that can decimate entire neighborhoods. And these governments are fighting over things that really don't impact our everyday lives as much as they impact the lives of the oil barons and the people who stand to make a profit if the war goes one way or another. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Everyday American people want peace. I think everyday Israeli people want peace. I think people in Gaza want peace. And I think the governments are holding their citizens hostage by waging wars like this that we don't agree with.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to be debated on that topic as the events in the Middle East continue to play out and potential escalations come. But as always, stay with Rising. We'll have more for you right after this.